Welcome back. So in Chapter 9, we're going to go over one of the newest and really best tools for implementing responsive web design into your websites, whether it be the entire page layout or just certain parts of the page. There's a lot of benefit to using these new methods over using the old methods of floats and clears. In this lesson, we want you to learn how to use Flexbox to lay out your web pages and components within those pages. We want you to be able to talk about how you might use Flexbox to lay out different parts of your page, explain certain terms, including Flexbox, flex item, main axis, cross axis, and flex direction. And we want to also know how the flex direction affects how the alignment properties work, specifically justify content and align items. So just some terminology when we're working with Flexbox. There's always what's called a main axis and a cross axis, and that depends on the direction of your Flexbox. So initially that your direction is going to be horizontal. And so that direction is horizontal, then your main axis is horizontal. If your direction is vertical, then your main axis is vertical. Okay. Your cross axis is then the other direction, the direction that's not in the main flow of your Flexbox. Okay. Sometimes we'll refer to the size of the main axis as the main size, or the cross size for the size of the cross axis. The start of the main axis would be here on the left normally, and then at the end there are ways to switch that direction. So it may be that left is on the right, and the end is on the left and the start is on the right, but there's always a start and an end to both of the axes. So the box that contains both of these items, we refer to that as the flex container, and then the items inside of that are flex items. So in this case, you see there's one flex item on the left and another flex item on the right. So let's say we want to build a nav bar, a navigation menu using Flexbox. Okay, so we might start by making the entire box, the entire nav, a flex container, and then we might say, well, each of the items are then going to be the flex items. Well, the way that we make that container a flex box is we just set the display property to flex. So we take our nav and we just apply display flex, and now it is a flex container. And by default, the direction of that flex box is horizontal. So if I just set display flex, everything will now be laid out horizontally from left to right. Now I have a few options for the direction. Okay, so I can pick row. Row is just the default, it goes left to right. Row reverse is the same, it's horizontal, but it's from right to left. So it's backwards. And similarly I can do with vertical direction. I can say if I make the flex direction column, then everything inside of that container will be arranged vertically. I can also do column reversed. It'll still be arranged vertically, but it'll be backwards. So it gives me, I have the ability in here to not just set it horizontally or vertically, but I can reverse it in either of those directions, and that can be helpful in a few cases. Okay, so for instance, if I want to say, let's make this nav bar here I've got my HTML, your nav tag with a UL and a bunch of LIs in it. I can just say, well, let's make the UL display flex, and then by default it would be flex row. If I want to then move it to be vertical to make it, say, make it a mobile nav bar, well, then I just change the flex direction to column. So I can say at maybe my mobile size, I have flex direction column, and then in a larger size, I say the flex direction is row. And that way I can very quickly get a nav bar or a nav menu that can be either vertical or horizontal depending on the direction of the flex container. And that's super, super handy. I can also, and this is one of those things that's new that you didn't really have access to when you were working with floats, is oftentimes I want to control the spacing between those items in the Flex container. Okay, so my only option when I'm working with floats is basically the first one, is say, well, put all the things at the beginning, right? Throw all the white space at the end, put everything at the beginning. But now I have a few different options. So I can set justify content to a few different things here. So if I set justify content to flex start, all the items will be at the beginning, all the white space will be at the end. If I set it to flex end, they'll all be at the end, all the white space will be at the beginning. Great, so I can effectively left align or right align. Similarly, I can set center, and everything will be in the center. All the white space will be evenly divided on the two sides. Great. Then I also have some more intricate solutions for how to spread out the spacing. So the first thing I can do is space between. It'll just say, well, okay, I'll take all the leftover space and divide evenly between each of the items. Now you'll notice the first item and the last item in space between will always be up against the edges. Okay, another thing I can do, space around, and what that'll do is it'll again evenly divide it up, but it evenly divides it up a different way. So it'll evenly divide it up in the ways that there's effectively a left margin on every item that's the same, left and right margin. So what that means is there's some space here, there's some space here. They're not butted up, but it means that there's twice as much space between each item, right? So there's more space here than there is on the edges. Then my third option is then I can also do space evenly. Space evenly is basically like space between. The only difference is when it divides it up evenly, it does give some at the beginning and does give some at the end. So if I don't want space at the beginning and end, I can use space between. If I do want space on the ends, I can use space evenly. So let's say I want to take that nav bar and now spread out the space evenly so that it's effectively centered. Effectively, any white space that's available is going to be centered. Notice that justify content always works on the main axis. So if I have extra space on the horizontal axis, it'll space it out this way. If there's, if I've arranged it as a column, then that space evenly will divide, justify content will divide the space vertically, whatever the flow direction is. So here we've got if I want to say, well, I want to make my nav bar nice and evenly spaced, I can just add in justify content space evenly, and now the links will be kind of have the same amount of space between them. Again, the default, if I don't specify anything, would be flex start. It would be all at the beginning. Another thing I can do, so justify content aligns things on the main axis. I can also align things on the cross axis. And this, again, is one of those things that there's no way to do aligning on the cross axis when you're working with floats. There's just not a way. So this is tremendously useful. So with align items, I specify this on the container, and I can say align it in a few different ways based on the cross axis. So if I want to line it all up at the top, say I've got this is all examples with your flex direction in the row direction. I could line it all up at the top with flex start, all at the bottom with flex end, centered. I could stretch it out so everything that's in the container gets stretched to the full height of the container, which is generally what you want for an app bar. If I'm building an app bar, I probably want all my items to be the same height, so I'm just going to stretch them to the height of the container. You can also specify baseline. Baseline's kind of like center, but it aligns the baseline of text instead of aligning the center of the height. So when you put text inside of something, inside of each of these elements, it may lead to better alignment. In some cases, to use baseline over center. You can also, if you want one item in the container to have a different alignment than the others, you can use align self on that item. So in this case, we've specified that the container is flex start, so normally everything would be at the top, but this one item is specified as flex end, so it's aligned at the bottom of the container. So I can do that for individual items, change their alignment along the cross-axis. Sometimes I may need to wrap my items onto more than one row. By default, Flex Wrap is set to no wrap, which means that everything is just going to try and fit everything onto that one row or that one column. But if you run out of space, if you have that potential, then you may want it to wrap on more than one line. In which case, you just set Flex Wrap to wrap, and it'll push the extra items down to the next line. Once you've done that, you also then may need to control the alignment of that as well. So there's another alignment property that you can put on the container called align content. And as you can see, so your first option is to take all the items and kind of align them at the top. You can align them at the bottom, the middle, or stretch them all out. Put the space evenly in between them, or put the space around them. So here we have no space at the beginning and the end. Here we have space at the beginning and the end. So again, when you're having wrapping going on, then you generally need to set this align content as well. Okay. Once we've done all those alignment pieces, we may also, the other thing we may want to do is control how things grow and shrink. So for instance, maybe I want to say, I don't want to have white space. Maybe I don't want to have space between my items. Maybe I want them to butt up right next to each other. So there's a few different settings I can set. Flex basis is going to be the first one of three we'll talk about. Flex basis kind of says what is the normal size of this item. Okay, so in here we're saying we've got a simple kind of page layout. We've got a 3-column layout with a nav, a section, and a side, all of which are in main. So we're going to make the main a Flexbox. And I'm going to assign nav and a side. Their basis is going to be 25%, and then the basis for the section is 50%. So what that means is whatever kind of size it's at, all right, the middle's going to get half of the space, and the other two will get 25% of the space. So that will allow because those all add up to 100%, they're always going to take up the full space. But you can see as I resize it, at 800 pixels, content takes up more space. At 400, you can see all three of these actually take up less space. So they can grow and shrink in that regard. Now, sometimes I want to have a little bit more control of how these resize, in which case I can specify the grow property, for instance, as well. By default, the grow property I believe is set to 0, so things don't grow. But you can set it to any positive number. So whatever positive number you have, it will add up all the items in that container, in that row, and determine how can I divide that up evenly? How can I divide that up to fill the entire space? So if I set them all to 1, well, then all of the items will grow evenly to fill up, in this case, like a third of the space. If I set one of them to a different number, well, then that one will get more of the space. So here in this first example, each of them will get a third of the space. If I set the grows 1, 2, and 1, the the left nav would get say 25% of the space. This one would get sort of 1/4 of the space. This would get 2/4 of the space, or half of the space, and this one would get 1/4 of the space. You add them all up, that gives you your fractions. So for example here, they've set the nav and asides to 1 and the section to 3, adds up to 5, 1, 3, and 1. So here at 400 pixels, we're seeing that this is, both of these are growing, but they're growing at different rates. So because this is 3, content will always have 3/5 of the space. Navigation and sidebar will always have 1/5 of the space. So we can use that to control how things grow, but also the main way I use that is to determine what should grow and what should not. So the more common way to set this up, I might say navigation and sidebar are 0, so they don't grow, but the content is 1. So the only thing that grows is the content. The others two stay the same size. I can also set the shrink property to determine how things should change as we run out of space. So in this case here, we've set each of the 3 items to be 250 pixels wide. So as long as there's 750 pixels of space or more, those will all get the space they need. But then I want to say, well, if there's less space, let's change which ones shrink. So here we've set the flex shrink to 0 on the nav, so the nav will not change size. But we have said section aside are 1, so they will shrink as it gets smaller. So as you can see here at 750 pixels, the navigation is exactly 250, but as this gets smaller to say 500, navigation hasn't changed because its shrink is 0, but the other two have a shrink that's non-zero, so they have gotten smaller. I can also use the flex property as a shorthand for the 3 we just talked about. So flex is a shorthand for grow, shrink, and then basis. So here we've set the nav and aside to a grow of 1, shrink of 1, and a basis of 100 pixels. Here we've got the section in the center has a grow and shrink of 2 and a basis of 300. So that means that for sure the content is going to grow and shrink a lot more, a lot faster than either the 2 side items. So we can see 500, okay, it's about 50-50. We've got the 100 pixels here, 100 pixels there, and exactly 300. As this gets larger, you can see the content gets quite a bit larger, but the navigation and sidebar only gets slightly larger. And then if we look at here, we can see that when it's much smaller, 250, the center, the content gets a lot smaller. The other two only get a little smaller, again because they have a smaller number for shrink. So let's say I want to lay out a simple page using Flexbox. Okay, so I might say header, aside, section, footer. So here my main, I've got maybe an aside and a section that I want to put next to each other, at least on desktop layouts. So I would set, normally I would set them to those be a Flexbox, and I would say that their direction is row. But then I might add a media query to say, well, if the screen size is 700 pixels or less, this is kind of doing it in a desktop first mode. I would say, well, when it's 760 pixels or less, let's change it to a column. Okay. Now the other thing I can do in here is I can also change the order of the items, which is actually a very handy feature. So maybe I want to control what order these appear once I've changed in a media query here, so for a different screen size. So it may be that at a certain screen size something's before or after, but here if we're looking at it in a mobile view, I want the section to be first and the aside to be second. So that's what I'm saying here. By default, the order of everything is 0. So you can kind of base that, use that as the baseline to determine where you want to put something. So if you put something at a negative number, it's going to be before where things are normally. Positive numbers are going to be generally after where things are normally. So here we set the aside. The section is going to be 1, so it's going to be first, and the aside is going to be second. So this is how that would look like in the browser. So it's a column. We've got header, section, sidebar, footer. Let's look at the example that they have here. So I'm going to pull up that file, open folder, and let's go to Book Apps, Chapter 9, Town Hall. I'm going to run this in the browser. So this is the Samson page with live server. So as I change and adjust the size of this page, okay, so we're not seeing much interesting happening here, although I am seeing, notice that the links are going, are all roughly, at least looks like they're the same size-ish. Looks like they're evenly spaced out. I also notice that here, when I get down to this point, it jumps down. So the aside was here, and now the aside is on top. So that's, you know, a few different things. There's a lot of different things that you can do with Flexbox. There's a lot, and specifically, there's a lot of things you can do with Flexbox that you can't do without Flexbox. Currently, the support for Flexbox is at the point where basically all major browsers support it, except for, well, older versions of IE. No version of IE supports Flexbox. Edge does. All current versions of Edge do, but no versions of Flexbox. But that's enough reason to go ahead and there's enough reason to go ahead and use it. The nice thing is, a lot of the time, even for older versions of IE, it may not understand it. It may not understand what to do with Flexbox, but it's often actually good enough what it ends up doing anyway. Usually, especially if you're building with a mobile first kind of view, it just means you're going to get the mobile version of the page when you open it up in IE. Now, there's a lot more info that you can read about Flexbox. I would strongly advise you to go read this article. It's called A Complete Guide to Flexbox. There's a lot of good, solid explanation of all the different properties and how they work, all in one page. So definitely take your time to read this. In fact, you will probably find a lot more information on this page than you find in Chapter 9, to be perfectly blunt. So definitely take your time to read through that. So to cover, or just refresh on what we've looked at here today, we've talked about how to use Flexbox to lay out pages and components on a web page. You know, you can use this for desktop layout. You can use it for mobile devices. Honestly, I use it for all of the above now. We talked about how to apply Flexbox to do some page layout. We talked about the terms Flexbox, Flex item. We talked about what the main axis is, the cross axis is, and the flex direction. We talked a little bit about the alignment properties, justify content, align items. Remember, justify content is always in the main axis direction, and the align items is always in the cross axis. So if you're doing column, or sorry, if our flex direction is row, justify will be horizontal and align items is vertical. But if the flex direction is column, then justify content is vertical and align items is horizontal. And that may seem like a weird thing for that to switch depending on your direction, but believe me when I say that it's actually usually very helpful. Usually when you're trying to develop websites that are responsive, the fact that that switches with the main axis direction switches and justify content and line item switches, it's actually tremendously, it's usually what you want. All right, that is the end of this. Again, definitely follow up on that article because there's a whole lot more information there, and a lot of good examples. Your reading assignments are up on Perusal, and your homework and lab assignments are up on Inside Rankin. See you later.